Hello everyone, this is Dr. Purnima, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya, admitted to the privileges of Banaras Hindu University. And here we are on week 2, module 2 of Postmodern Art and Literature, Theory and Practice. And in this module and this lecture 4, we are going to discuss postmodern, postcolonial fiction. So when we talk about post-colonial and postmodern fiction, there are two things that will come to our mind. One is the end of colonial regime and the end of the modern times, but it is also a break from the colonial and modern times, but it is also a continuity of a new kind of colonialism, new imperialism and new colonialism developing from the post-colonial times. So it is a fusion of two literary movements. These works seek to challenge and rewrite dominant colonial histories, and they talk about the fragmented structures, and they're often structured non-linearly, and these stories are use fragmented timelines. Again, we can take the example of Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, and we can take example of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, and there's a shifting of perspectives. This reflects the disorienting legacy of colonization. And then there is this cross-cultural storytelling. So storytelling has been used as a technique, as Midnight Children begins with Once Upon a Time. So Once Upon a Time, it reminds you of the Arabian Nights, and how these stories and myths and oral history have created the narratives of the post-colonial world. So it is a post-colonial, postmodern fiction which is blending oral traditions. It is talking about oral traditions, indigenous mythology, and European literary forms. And it represents hybrid identities and cultural intersections. And that's why we are talking about mimicry and hybridity that is reflected in literature. And it has a global relevance. So it is a powerful tool for expressing marginalized voices in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And these narratives help globalize the literary landscape. So when we talk about post-colonialism in literature, what we are actually discussing is the aftermath of colonization. So basically, when these countries got independent, especially the African and Asian countries, they thought that this is a new era and a new hope began in the society. But a few years from independence, when a country like India, when it got into Sino-Indian War, and then they were caught up in corruption, and there was partition, and there were so many things happening in these countries. There was poverty, and there was deprivation, and there were civil rights movements. So all these countries were facing storms and challenges from outside and from within the society. So these works explore how colonialism impacted nations politically, culturally, and psychologically. So this is political, it is cultural, and it is also on a mental level. It is very psychological, and characters often carry inherited trauma and displacement. So it is generational trauma that remain in the younger ones, and there is also this looking towards the West. So people aim or aspire to move to America or Canada to have better prospects of life. So this looking towards West for a better hope is again something that we can see as a very important impact of post-colonialism. Then they are also trying to reclaim their history, and this history is also intertwined with their identity. So post-colonial literature aims to reframe historical events, because history has been written from the perspective of the imperialist, from the colonizer's perspective. So the colonized, their voices have been subdued. So they want to have their reclamation, and they want to say their own narratives and their own history, and it exposes the biases of colonial historiography. Then there is this cultural resistance that is very important. So the themes of resistance, rebellion, and decolonization are central to these fiction and novels. Characters often fight to preserve their language, traditions, and identity. And then we have discussed about Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? So the subaltern perspective becomes very important. The marginalized communities and their perspective become very important in the works of post-colonial authors. So it highlights the lives of the subaltern, those marginalized under empire. These characters represent the silenced masses rather than the ruling elite, and it is about hybridity and creolization. Creole is again a term borrowed from linguistics, which is talking about the mixing of languages. So languages, because there was a lot of mixing of the European languages with the native languages, so new form of language, a hybrid form of language was being formed, which in Rushdie's word is the chutnification of language. That language have been so mixed with each other that we cannot distinguish one from another. So writers explore hybrid identities born from the collision of cultures, and language, religion, and customs are often shown in fluid mixed forms. Then we come to magic realism. So, this is one of the very important devices, and we have discussed a lot about magic realism in postmodern literature, because the impact of postmodern art is very evident in magic realism. Because postmodern art, like Dali's painting, or Van Gogh's painting, or Picasso's painting, when they are using fragmentation or when they are using surrealism, this is reflected in magic realism. So magic realism is making the world surreal. It is making the real world magical. So how and why it is used. So sometimes people feel that why magic realism is one of the tools and devices that is used by these post-colonial authors. So sometimes the reality is so harsh that when you try to talk about it, it becomes very difficult to put it in words. And sometimes there is a lot of censorship. So to avoid the censorship, by adding some kind of magical elements to it and mixing history with fiction, sometimes a lot of biases can be removed from the text. So, magic realism presents the magical as normal and unquestioned. It allows cultural myths and supernatural events to coexist with realism. And it is rooted in colonized cultures originating in Latin America. And the first users of magic realism were from Latin America. It becomes vital in post colonial literature globally. It gives space to indigenous worldviews suppressed by colonial narratives. And then here myth meets modernity, and these stories are often blend of ancestral myths with modern political reality. So they are what they are actually doing is they are somehow preserving the ancestral myths, and they are mixing it with the modern realities. The result is a layered reality that defies Western logic. And then normalizing the supernatural, because it is also talking about superstitions at some level that were predominantly part of these ancient, antiquated societies. So they talk about events like ghosts, prophecies, miracles, like again, midnight children, or you can also see it in Shalimar the Clown, or we can also see in other works of Rushdie like Harun and the Sea of Stories. So miraculous events happen, prophecies happen, ghosts come up, and there are metaphor, because allegorical magic realism allows a lot of use of metaphors and allegories. So miraculous occurrences are treated as part of everyday life, and this reflects a worldview where the spiritual is embedded in the real. So examples in literature, of course, we have discussed at length. Rushdie's Midnight Children, Ben Okri's The Famous Road, and this uses magic realism to address national identity and colonial trauma. Then surrealism and post-colonial fiction, because we have discussed in the first module about surrealism and its impact on later postmodern literature. So surrealism is a very important literary tool because it helps to break the boundary between dream and reality, and it allows authors to explore trauma, desire, depressed cultural memory, and colonial trauma is made visible. So, surrealist techniques express psychological pain from slavery, war, or displacement, and uncanny imagery reveals the deep scars left by empire. So, liberation and from realist constraints are also there in post-colonial fiction, and they abandon strict realism. They move from the modern realism, and the writers can represent the absurdity and emotional truth of colonized lives. Surrealism defies the rationalism of colonizers, and it uses symbolic and emotional logic. So, surreal scenes often follow emotional or symbolic logic rather than narrative logic, and this mimics how trauma is processed in the mind. So, notable works is Toni Morrison's Beloved, which uses the story of a haunted house, and it blends realism with surreal, ghostly presence to deal with the horrors, slavery, memory, and memory repression. So, when we talk about post colonial fiction, we talk about historical fiction, and we also talk about how it has entered into post colonial perspective. So, through writing historical fiction, they are often trying to reclaim their past. So, post colonial authors use historical fiction to challenge official colonial accounts. They revise the past from the point of view of the colonized, and they talk about myth and memory over facts. So facts can also be data, and facts and statistics can also be manipulated. So these works often mix personal memory with national history and myths. This subjective history validates emotional truth over documented facts. And this also subverts historical authority by reimagining events or inserting fictional characters into real histories. Author question who gets to write history and why. And then there's this focus on marginalized narratives, and women, indigenous people, and the enslaved are often at the center of these post colonial writers. These stories prioritize those excluded from conventional historical records, and it also discusses the intergenerational trauma that effects of historical violence are shown as ripple across generations. Character inherit both memory and trauma from their families, like Salim Sinai gets it from his family. So, when we discuss the key authors and texts of post colonial literature, the first and foremost appears Salman Rushdie. He has got Booker and Best of Booker for his work Midnight Children. So, it becomes one of the most magnum opus of Salman Rushdie, and it uses magic realism to portray the birth of modern India. So, Salim Sinai, from his birth, is handcuffed to history, and the protagonist's life parallels national events, blending history with fantasy, and it discusses emergency in India, it discusses Indo-Chinese war, and it also discusses the state where India is full of corruption and getting out of it. So, and then very important is Gabriel Garcia Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude. So it talks, again a very foundational text in magic realism. It presents a cyclical view of history. So history is not linear. And in a fictional Latin American town, Macando, where things are repeating itself. Then is Toni Morrison's Beloved. It explores the horrors of American slavery through ghostly hauntings. And Morrison uses surrealism to depict historical trauma and memory. Then again, very important is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. So it tells the story of colonial disruption in the Igbo society. So it discusses how the Igbo society lives and how it is polygamy is prevalent in the Igbo society, and yet they have their own cultural norms, they have their own proverbs, their own way of living, and that cannot be denied or decided by the Western world. So Achebe uses a realist style infused with African oral tradition, trying to represent the true Africa, because he is a critique of Heart of Darkness, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and he says that he just doesn't, because a white author in Achebe's mind is not able to give the voice to the African people. So he wants to write the true story of African people, and he gives a more humanistic, not very dehumanized perspective of African people. So Arundhati Roy, the god of small things, is also very important, as he also uses non-linear storytelling and she uses poetic prose, and she explores the class consciousness in Indian society. So she explores caste, class, trauma, and post-colonial identity in India. So when we look at the themes of post-colonial, postmodern fiction, we find some common themes. So one of them is cultural hybridity. So most of the writers across the globe are diasporic writers who are talking about, and this is again a multicultural, multilingual, plural society. So there are characters often embody multiple conflicting identities, and this reflect the blending of clashing of colonized and colonizer cultures. Then there is a language as control and tool of resistance. So colonial languages are both tools of oppression and means of resistance. Writers creatively reshape English to reflect native idioms and phrases and proverbs and experiences. Then it is also about displacement and exile. So migration and dislocation are central themes, like we can see in V.S. Naipaul's The House for Mr. Vishwas. And many characters they live in diaspora, navigating identity across borders, and they are interrogating history. And these stories challenge who writes history and how. They present alternative or hidden version of historical events. And there is also struggle for self-definition. So characters often seek to define themselves outside colonial binaries, and the journey towards identity is complicated and deeply personal. So what are the narrative techniques and literary devices? Again, nonlinear timelines, very common in postmodern fiction. So the stories unfold through flashbacks, time loops, disrupted chronology, and this reflect trauma and the cyclical nature of memory. So the trauma that they have inherited, that is also represented in their works through their narrative techniques. And there are multiple narrators. They are the polyphonic or the dialogic voices, and they present conflicting truths, realities, and perspectives. And this mimics a post-colonial society's diversity of thought. Then there is a genre blending, so it mixes realism with myth, folklore, satire, and speculative elements. And this hybrid form resists categorization and reflects on hybrid identities. Then there is a lot of use of symbolism and allegory, and there is heavy use of metaphor and symbolism, which reflects on the deeper cultural and political meanings. And allegory is often used to critique colonialism. And then there is this unreliable narrator or errata. Narrators are often mislead, they forget, or they contradict themselves. This questions the possibility of objective truth, especially in colonized histories. Thank you, that's all.